Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about whether or not you need to take a rest day when you are undergoing hybrid training. And largely, the point of this video is going to be that whether or not a rest day emerges from your programming it shouldn't really be a primary focus. So, as you may have guessed, the answer to that question, at least my answer to that question, is going to be no, you don't have to take a rest day if that's just the way writing your program comes out. That doesn't mean you should be training at full intensity every day of the week, though. There are certain kinds of training sessions that you can do while you are fatigued from a previous training session that aren't going to demand a lot from you in terms of recovery, but are going to meaningfully add to your totally weekly volume accumulation of whatever that kind of training volume or session was. And this is a very simplistic, easy example here. So if you got on a stationary bike for 30 minutes at about 50 to 60% of your max heart rate. And now that's kind of probably going to be more of a true like zone 2-ish kind of heart rate on a bike because zone 2 is very exercise specific. That's kind of a different topic. But let's say you did this, this would meaningfully add to your total weekly aerobic training volume across the week, but it's not going to leave you fatigued or not ready to do anything the next day or anything like that. So in other words, let's say you had 6 core sessions that you're doing Monday through Saturday, just for example's sake. And then Sunday was sort of up in the air. If you took Sunday as a rest day or you did this, the way you would feel on Monday would probably be exactly the same. But doing this session is going to give you just, that much little bit extra of aerobic volume. So again, bluntly, the answer to the question, at least my answer, is that no, you don't need to take a rest day. You don't need a rest day. There's no rationale to say that one is required. But that does not mean you're training super hard every single day. Another point worth mentioning is that whether or not a rest day emerges from your program writing could just be a function of training frequency. And that does not necessarily mean that you're training more or less or anything like that. So let's say you have some fixed amount of strength training and some fixed amount of endurance training that you're going to do across a given week. And you could split that up into less but longer sessions or more shorter sessions across the week. The first format could likely lead to a number of different rest days being had across the week, whereas the second might end up having 0 just by way of, there being more sessions, but shorter sessions. But again, the total amount of time in each sort of scenario spent training is exactly the same, at least, for the purposes of what we're trying to describe here. And one or the other may or may not be more sort of time efficient with your schedule, depending on what your week looks like overall. So my point in saying this is that the existence of a rest day in a training program does not mean that the training program is more time efficient. Because again, I've spoke about this at length in a number of my other videos and articles and whatnot, but once you identify what the proper dose of strength training or endurance training is, your next sort of order of business is to split that up across the week, however it works best for you. That might mean there's rest day. It might not mean there's a rest day. But again, you program based on what makes sense with your schedule, and whether or not that means rest day does not really matter. And then finally, just to sort of wrap things up here, let's say you are doing real trainings, long trainings, somewhat intense trainings every day of the week. That also isn't an impossible thing to do and, to do well and do smart. Your ability to recover from training is itself something that can be trained. So the first point I have here is novelty. And so, for instance, when I write a given training block for a client, the way this typically goes is that I write a sort of weekly structure. That might be a fixed structure. That might be a sort of dynamic structure, depending on what their life is like. But in any case, there is some sort of weekly structure that repeats on a weekly basis. That weekly structure of training will be repeated usually anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks at a time. The purpose of doing so is that your body will become somewhat adapted to that weekly training structure. And as the weeks go on, you will be able to train harder and recover better. And, as a result, see much better progress. Because again, just to reiterate, the novelty of a movement or a training session or anything like that is one of the main things that's going to drive needless soreness and recovery demand and things like that. And when you change up your training structure every single week, that's one of those things that can just sort of keep you spinning your wheels and not really making the progress that you should be making based on your effort. And then something else worth mentioning is that the process of recovering from a training session is itself an aerobic, cardiovascularly limited process. In other words, the better your aerobic fitness is, the better your recovery is likely to be from any given training session. Now, just to be transparent, I don't believe there is any, good hard data out there that's really tested that. It's one of those things that's just sort of thought of because it makes sense from a sort of face validity perspective. But anecdotally, in my experience, I do tend to see that be the case. As people develop in their endurance and their cardiovascular fitness, they do seem to be able to sort of handle more volume without it running them down per se. So bottom line of the video is that no, you don't need a rest day. And in my opinion, it's really just not something that you should be thinking about so much. It should just be something that, comes out if the way you write the program written for you is just the way it works out. So hopefully that all makes sense. Of course, any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And apart from that, I'm gonna wrap this up here. So I will see you later. Hope you have a good one.